The fog in Pike County doesn't just sit on the mountains. It swallows them. On the morning of November 15, 1987, that fog was thick enough to hide a war zone. At 6:42 a.m., a silence hung over Dead Man's Hollow that was heavier than usual. A silence that felt unnatural even for a Sunday morning in deep Appalachia. It was the kind of quiet that usually follows a catastrophe, the moment after the echo of the last explosion has finally died out against the limestone ridges. When Kentucky State Trooper Jim Pendergrass turned his cruiser onto the gravel switchback of Route 19, he was responding to a noise complaint call that had come in 4 hours earlier. Reports of what sounded like blasting caps going off in the dark. He expected poachers. Maybe teenagers with fireworks left over from the 4th of July. What he found was a scene that would force him into early retirement 3 months later. The first thing Pendergrass saw wasn't a body, it was a machine. A massive, vintage Caterpillar D9 bulldozer painted a defiant yellow that seemed to scream against the gray backdrop of the winter woods. It was parked dead center in the muddy clearing that marked the property line between two families. The engine was cold, but the smell of diesel fuel was overpowering, mixing with the metallic tang of copper blood and the sulphurous stench of burnt gunpowder. Suspended from the bucket of that bulldozer, dangling by a steel logging chain wrapped around his ankles, was Buck Brody. He had been stripped to his waist and his chest had been used as a target for what looked like high-caliber hunting ammunition. Pendergrass would later testify that the arrangement was medieval, a public display of dominance that belonged in the 14th century, not in modern America. But as Pendergrass walked further into the hollow, retching into his handkerchief, he realized Buck was just the beginning. Over the next 3 miles of dense forest, police would find 10 more bodies. They weren't just killed, they were hunted. They were eliminated with a precision that suggested military tactics, not a chaotic hillbilly feud. And sitting on his front porch, just 2 miles up the ridge from the carnage, was Arthur Vance. He was wearing his Sunday best, a charcoal suit he usually saved for deacon duties at the Free Will Baptist Church. He was drinking coffee from a chipped ceramic mug, and on the table beside him sat a meticulously cleaned Remington Model 700 rifle and a hand-drawn map. When Pendergrass approached, gun drawn and trembling, Arthur didn't raise his hands. He didn't run. He just pointed at the map and said, in a voice as flat as the asphalt he used to lay, "I finished the job, Jim. The road is clear now." To understand why a church deacon and decorated Korean War veteran would execute 11 neighbors in a single night, you have to look past the blood. You have to look at the dirt. You have to understand Pike County in 1987. This was a place where the American dream hadn't just died. It had been murdered by economics. The coal boom was over. Mines that had fed families for 3 generations were boarding up their shafts. Unemployment hovered near 45%. Men who were defined by their ability to work, to provide, to bend the earth to their will, were suddenly told they were obsolete. In this vacuum of purpose, dignity became the only currency left. When you have no money, no job, and no future, respect is the only thing putting food on the soul's table. And God help the man who tries to steal it. Arthur Vance, known to everyone in the valley as Big Art, was a man carved out of that dignity. 58 years old, with hands that looked like they were made of cured leather and knuckles swollen from 3 decades of handling pneumatic drills. He wasn't just a laborer, he was a master blaster, a certified expert in explosives who had cleared the way for Interstate 64. He understood structure. He understood that if you place the charge in the exact right stress point, you can bring down a mountain without damaging the house at its foot. He was a man of order in a world that was falling into chaos, and the center of his universe, the physical manifestation of his life's work, was that Caterpillar D9. He had bought the bulldozer as a wreck in 1979, salvaging it from a defunct strip mine. For 8 years, he and his 4 sons, Silas, Caleb, Joshua, and Luke, had spent every spare evening restoring it. They didn't just fix it. They resurrected it. They replaced the hydraulics, rebuilt the transmission gear by gear, and painted it a yellow so bright it hurt to look at in the sun. That machine wasn't a vehicle. It was a member of the family. It was their livelihood. With the mines closed, Arthur used the D9 to cut private roads, clear timber, and grade land for the few people who could still afford to build. It put food on the table for 12 people: Arthur, his wife Martha, their sons, and the grandchildren. In Arthur's mind, that 40-ton beast of steel was the only thing standing between his lineage and the welfare line. It was his independence. Living adjacent to the Vance property, down in the darker, damper part of the hollow, were the Brodys. If the Vances represented the old guard of Appalachian discipline, the Brodys represented the new decay. Buck Brody, 40 years old, was a man who thrived on the collapse. He was a scrapper, a copper thief, a man who saw other people's property as a suggestion rather than a law. Buck didn't build things. He took them apart. He ran an illegal salvage yard that spilled over onto everyone else's land: rusting cars, piles of stolen wire, and mountains of trash that leached chemicals into the creek Arthur used to water his garden. Buck was loud, charismatic in a terrifying way, and utterly devoid of fear. He drove a lifted truck with a bumper sticker that read, "Protected by Smith & Wesson," and he walked through town with the swagger of a man who knew the local sheriff was too underfunded and too exhausted to touch him. The friction between Arthur Vance and Buck Brody didn't start with a gunshot. It started with inches. For years, Buck had been pushing the boundary line. A fence post moved here, a junk car parked there. It was the creeping invasion of a man testing the waters. Arthur, a man who believed in the rule of law and the sanctity of boundaries, had tried to handle it the right way. He went to the courthouse. He filed complaints. He paid a surveyor with money he couldn't afford to mark the line officially. The surveyor drove the stakes, and 2 days later, Buck Brody pulled them up and used them as firewood for a bonfire party that kept the Vance family awake until 3 a.m. But the psychological break, the moment where the escalation ladder began its fatal climb, happened on November 10th, 5 days before the massacre. It began with the kind of minor incident that history usually forgets: the spark that lands in a room full of gasoline. Arthur had parked the D9 near the creek to clear a blockage that was flooding the lower pasture. When he went to start it the next morning, the engine wouldn't turn over. It wasn't a mechanical failure, it was a surgical removal. The high-pressure hydraulic pump, a specific component worth about $8,000 in 1987 money, more than Arthur made in a year, was gone. Arthur didn't need a detective. He saw the boot prints in the mud. He saw the drag marks leading directly toward the Brody salvage yard. This wasn't just theft. In the code of the mountains, taking a man's tools is akin to cutting off his hands. It's an act of castration. You aren't just taking steel, you are taking his ability to be a man, to be a father, to be a husband. Arthur stood in the mud, staring at the empty cavity in the machine's engine block, and for the first time in his life, he didn't pray. He calculated. He tried the diplomatic route one last time. This is the part of the story that makes what followed so tragic. Arthur Vance didn't want a war. He wanted his pump. He drove his Ford pickup down to Buck Brody's trailer. He didn't bring a gun. He brought his son, Silas, as a witness. When they pulled up, Buck was in the yard, stripping wire. "Buck," Arthur said, leaning out the window, keeping his voice steady, the voice of the deacon. "I need my pump back. No questions asked, just leave it by the gate and we're square." Buck didn't even look up. He just laughed. A dry, hacking sound. "Old man," Buck said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but if you lost something, maybe you should take better care of your junk. Or maybe it just decided to leave you, like your luck did." Then Buck whistled. From under the porch, 2 Rottweilers, chained but aggressive, lunged against their tethers, snapping inches from the truck door. "Best get off my land, Art," Buck smiled, revealing teeth stained with tobacco. "Before the chain breaks." Arthur rolled up the window and drove away. Silas was gripping the dashboard so hard his knuckles were white. "Dad, we can't let him do that. We know he has it." "We'll call the sheriff," Arthur said. But he knew. He knew Sheriff Pendergrass had 2 deputies for a county of 400 square miles. He knew that without a serial number or an eyewitness to the actual theft, it was just one word against another. He knew the system was broken. That night, the sheriff came out, took a report, and shrugged. "Art, unless you find it on his property and call me, there's not much I can do. It's a civil matter." A civil matter. The phrase bounced around Arthur's skull like a trapped bird. $8,000. The winter was coming. The contract to clear the access road for the Miller farm was due next week. Without the pump, the dozer was a paperweight. Without the contract, they didn't make the mortgage payment. It wasn't civil, it was survival. But the final straw, the event that pushed Arthur Vance from a frustrated neighbor into a cold-blooded tactician, happened on Thursday, November 12th. It was the public humiliation phase, the most dangerous step on the ladder of violence. Arthur and Silas went into town to try and find a replacement part at the heavy equipment dealer. They stopped at Mabel's Diner for lunch. The place was packed. Miners out of work, retirees, the lunchtime crowd. Buck Brody was there. He was sitting in a center booth with 3 of his cousins, loud, drunk on midday beer, holding court. When Arthur walked in, the room went quiet. Everyone knew about the dispute. In a small town, privacy is a myth. Buck stood up. He held up a greasy napkin. "Hey, Deacon," he shouted across the room. "I drew you a map to the scrapyard, in case you want to sell that yellow heap of yours. I hear it ain't running so good lately. I'll give you $50 for the scrap weight." The laughter from the Brody table wasn't just loud, it was sharp. It cut. But Buck didn't stop there. He looked at Silas, then back at Arthur. "Tell you what, Art. Since you're broke, I'll let you keep the tracks. You can use them to crawl back to your porch." Arthur stood frozen. He felt the eyes of the entire town on him. He felt the pity in Mabel's eyes behind the counter. He felt the burning shame of his son standing next to him, waiting for his father to do something, to be the man he preached about on Sundays, to be the master blaster who moved mountains. But Arthur did nothing. He didn't shout. He didn't throw a punch. He turned around, walked out the door, and got in his truck. This was the moment of the death of the self. The Arthur Vance who believed in turning the other cheek died on the linoleum floor of Mabel's Diner. The man who sat in the truck, staring blankly at the rain sliding down the windshield, was someone else entirely. He was quiet. He was calm. He was terrifying. "Dad?" Silas asked, terrified by the silence. Arthur didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of any inflection. "Go to the hardware store, Silas. Buy 6 rolls of duct tape, a box of galvanized pipe, and batteries. Then go to your uncle's and get the deer rifles." "Dad, what are you doing?" "We're going to fix the road," Arthur said, "and we're going to clear the trash." For the next 48 hours, the Vance property became a forward operating base. This is where the story shifts from a tragedy of poverty to a horror of precision. Arthur didn't just plan a murder. He planned a demolition. He went into his basement, a place where he kept his old mining gear. He had cases of explosive residue, blasting caps he'd saved from the 1970s, and enough ammonium nitrate to level a city block. He gathered his 4 sons and his 2 oldest grandsons. He sat them down around the kitchen table, the same table where they said grace every Thanksgiving. He laid out the map of the hollow. "The law is dead," Arthur told them. He looked each of them in the eye. "Buck Brody didn't just steal a pump, he stole our name. He stole your inheritance. If we let this stand, we are nothing. We are less than the dirt we move." He didn't scream. He didn't rant. He gave them a technical briefing. He assigned sectors of fire. Silas, the best shot, would take the high ridge overlooking the Brody compound. Caleb and Joshua would secure the logging road to the east. Luke would drive the truck. And Arthur would take the front door. He used his knowledge of the terrain to turn the geography against his enemies. The Brody compound was located in a box canyon with only one bridge in and out. Arthur knew that bridge. He had helped build it 20 years ago. He knew exactly where the stress points were. "Yo, 1 hours," Arthur said, checking his watch against the kitchen clock. "We blow the bridge. That cuts the phone lines running underneath it. No escape, no 911, just us and them." It was a plan birthed from the irony bank of fate. The skills Arthur had used to build the county's infrastructure, explosives, surveying, heavy machinery operation, were now being weaponized to destroy its citizens. The very things that made him a constructive member of society were about to make him its most efficient killer. Saturday night fell like a shroud. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees. The fog rolled in, thick and white, muffling sound, distorting light. It was perfect blasting weather. Arthur dressed slowly. He put on his thermal underwear, his work boots, his wool trousers. He put on his suit jacket. It was a strange choice, but to Arthur this was a formal occasion. It was a rite of passage. It was an act of cleansing. At 11:30 p.m., the Vance men moved out. They didn't take the road. They moved through the timber, stepping on the moss to hide their sound, navigating by the light of the moon and memory. They carried the pipe bombs Arthur had constructed, simple, brutal devices filled with black powder and nails. They carried the Remington 700, the Winchester 30-30, and the Mossberg shotgun. As they reached the ridge overlooking the Brody salvage yard, they could hear the faint sound of music. Buck was having another party. The glow of a bonfire flickered against the rusted hulks of crushed cars. There was laughter. There was the clinking of bottles. They had no idea that they were sitting in the center of a kill zone. Arthur Vance lay on his stomach in the wet leaves, looking through the scope of his rifle. He adjusted for the wind. He adjusted for the elevation drop. He centered the crosshairs not on Buck, but on the transformer box on the pole behind the trailer. He wanted darkness first. "Check your watches," Arthur whispered into the handheld radio, a relic from his foreman days. "Midnight is the start of the new day. We start fresh." Silas, lying 20 yards to his left, was shaking. "Dad, are you sure? Once we pull this trigger?" "There is no coming back," Arthur cut him off. "There is only forward. The pump is gone, Silas. The truck is gone. The dignity is gone. All we have left is the clearing." Down in the hollow, Buck Brody tossed a beer bottle into the fire. It shattered, sending sparks up into the fog. He laughed at something his cousin said, throwing his head back, exposing his throat to the cold night air. He looked like a king in his kingdom of rust. At 11:59 p.m., Arthur Vance exhaled. His breath hung in the air, a white ghost in the darkness. His finger tightened on the trigger. He wasn't thinking about murder. He was thinking about the hydraulic pump. He was thinking about the boot prints. He was thinking about the way the diner went silent. The clock struck midnight. Arthur fired. The transformer exploded in a shower of blue sparks, plunging the hollow into absolute, terrifying darkness. And then, from the bridge a mile down the road, came the deep, earth-shaking thump of the primary charge detonating. The bridge collapsed into the creek. The trap was shut. The point of no return had been crossed, not with a step, but with a shock wave. In the sudden blackness of the hollow, the laughter stopped instantly. Chaos took over. "What the hell was that?" someone screamed. "Buck, the lights!" Arthur racked the bolt of his rifle. The sound was mechanical, precise, final. "Light them up," he said into the radio. From the ridgeline, 4 muzzle flashes lit up the fog simultaneously. The sound wasn't a bang, it was a roar. The echoes slammed against the canyon walls, amplifying the violence, making 4 rifles sound like a battalion. Down in the yard, the dirt kicked up around the bonfire. Men scrambled, diving behind car doors, behind stacks of tires, not knowing where the fire was coming from, not knowing who was attacking or why. But this wasn't a suppression fire. This was Sniping. Arthur had marked the targets. He knew where they would run. He knew the layout of the salvage yard better than they did because he had studied it from this ridge for 3 days. Target 1. Down. Silas's voice crackled on the radio. Target 2. Suppressed, Caleb reported. Arthur didn't fire again yet. He was watching for Buck. He didn't want Buck dead. Not yet. Death was too easy. Death was a release. Arthur wanted an audience. He wanted Buck to understand. He watched the thermal shadow of a man sprinting toward the excavator, the only piece of heavy machinery Buck owned, a rusted grapple loader. "Don't shoot the loader," Arthur commanded. "Let him get in." It was a twisted game of cat and mouse. Arthur watched as Buck scrambled into the cab of the loader, trying to start it, maybe thinking he could use the bucket as a shield, or maybe trying to flee across the creek. The engine sputtered and roared to life. The headlights cut through the gloom, 2 beams of light sweeping across the scene of the ambush. That was Arthur's cue. He aimed at the hydraulic line of the loader's boom arm, the same part Buck had stolen from him. He fired. The bullet severed the high-pressure hose. Hydraulic fluid sprayed out like arterial blood, coating the windshield, blinding Buck, rendering the machine useless. "Now," Arthur whispered to himself. "Now you know what it feels like to be powerless." The shooting stopped as abruptly as it began. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the groans of the wounded and the hissing of the severed hydraulic line. This was the eye of the storm. The Vances descended from the ridge, moving like ghosts through the smoke. They weren't running. They were walking. They had the high ground. They had the guns. They had the righteous indignation of men who believed they were the hand of God. Arthur walked straight toward the loader. Buck was trapped inside, frantically trying to wipe the oil from the glass. He saw the figure of Arthur Vance emerge from the fog, illuminated by the dying bonfire. Arthur looked like a demon in a Sunday suit. Buck opened the door, raising a pistol. "You crazy son of a bitch," he screamed. "You killed them. You killed my cousins." Arthur didn't break stride. He fired a single shot from the hip. The bullet took Buck in the shoulder, spinning him around, dropping the pistol into the mud. Buck fell out of the cab, landing hard in the dirt, clutching his bleeding arm. Arthur stood over him. The muzzle of the Remington was smoking in the cold air. "My pump," Arthur said. "Where is it?" Buck looked up, eyes wide with shock and pain. "Art, please. It's in the shed. I was going to sell it tomorrow. Please." "You were going to sell my life," Arthur said. He signaled to Silas. "Get the chain." This leads us to the moment Trooper Pendergrass would find hours later. The moment of the irony. They didn't just kill Buck. They used the very machinery of industry, the tool of their trade, to stage the execution. Silas backed the Vance's truck up, dragged the heavy logging chain out. They wrapped it around Buck's ankles. "You like machines so much, Buck?" Arthur asked, his voice devoid of anger, just cold, hard fact. "You like taking them apart? Let's see how you handle being part of one." They hooked the chain to the bucket of Buck's own broken loader. Arthur climbed into the cab, the seat slick with the fluid that represented the stolen wealth. He worked the controls. The engine groaned. The boom arm lifted, jerky and shuddering. Buck screamed as he was hoisted into the air, upside down, swinging 5 feet off the ground. He was staring right at Arthur's face through the oil-smeared glass. "Look at it," Arthur commanded, pointing through the windshield at the desolate, junk-filled yard. "Look at what you built. Nothing. You built nothing." Arthur got out of the cab. He walked to where Buck was swinging. He took out the pipe bomb from his pocket. He lit the fuse with his Zippo lighter. The flame flared up, illuminating the terror in Buck's eyes. "For the road," Arthur said. He didn't throw the bomb. He placed it carefully on the ground, directly beneath Buck's swaying head. Then he turned and walked away. And Arthur Vance had a list. The echo of the pipe bomb didn't just fade. It rolled down the valley floor like a physical weight, pressing the air out of the hollow. For 10 seconds, there was absolute silence, the kind that follows a thunderclap before the screaming started. It didn't come from Buck Brody. He was gone, his chest cavity shattered by the concussive force of the blast that had swung him like a pendulum into the afterlife. The screams came from the double-wide trailer 50 yards away, where Buck's cousins, Ray and Skeeter, had been sleeping off a night of bourbon and bad decisions. They were awake now, jolted into a nightmare where the earth itself seemed to be exploding. Arthur Vance didn't flinch at the sound. He didn't look back at the smoking crater beneath the excavator bucket where the leader of the Brody clan now hung like a twisted marionette. He simply checked his watch, tilting his wrist to catch the faint moonlight. 12:08 a.m. The timeline was drifting. In Arthur's world, efficiency was the only wall separating this from a chaotic massacre. A massacre was messy, emotional, a crime of passion. This was an excavation. You drill the holes, you set the charges, you clear the debris. Move to phase 2, Arthur said, his voice barely rising above a whisper, yet carrying perfectly in the damp, cold air. From the tree line, Silas and Caleb emerged. They weren't running. Panic is for prey. Predators move with purpose. They carried their rifles at the low ready, barrels pointed at the wet leaves, safeties off. The fog was their ally now, swirling around the halogen security lights of the salvage yard, turning the beams into solid cones of white milk that hid everything outside their direct glare. Ray Brody kicked open the front door of the trailer, a pump-action shotgun in his hands, shirtless, his silhouette framed perfectly against the backlit interior hallway. It was a tactical error a rookie soldier wouldn't make, but Ray wasn't a soldier. He was a bully who had spent his life intimidating people who couldn't fight back. He was looking for a target he could scare. He found a firing squad. Silas didn't hesitate. He raised the Winchester .30-30. The woodstock pressed tight against his cheek. The shot was clean, a single crack that sounded like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. Ray folded backward, the shotgun clattering onto the aluminum porch steps, discharging a harmless round into the night sky. "One down," Silas said into the radio. There was no joy in his voice, just the flat affect of a man punching a time card at the end of a shift. Inside the trailer, the lights went out. Skeeter Brody was smarter, or perhaps just more terrified. He killed the main breaker, plunging the residents into darkness. But Arthur had anticipated this. He had anticipated everything. He signaled to Joshua and Luke, who were positioned near the rear of the structure, near the rusted propane tank that fed the trailer's heater. "Flush him," Arthur commanded. Luke tossed a tear gas canister through the bedroom window. It wasn't military grade. It was something Arthur had concocted in his basement using ammonia and bleach, stabilized in a mason jar, crude, chemical, and terrifyingly effective. The sound of shattering glass was followed immediately by the sound of coughing, a wet, hacking retch that sounded like a drowning man trying to breathe water. Skeeter burst out the back door, blinded, stumbling, hands clawing at his burning eyes, mucus streaming from his nose. He ran straight into the wire fence Arthur's sons had reinforced earlier that evening. He didn't die from a bullet. He died from the geography of his own greed. In his blind panic, Skeeter scrambled up the pile of crushed cars, the inventory Buck had been so proud of, trying to reach the high ground, trying to get above the gas. He slipped on a hood slick with oil and rain. He fell 20 feet, landing neck first on a protruding axle of a 1974 Chevy Nova. The snap was audible from the gate. Arthur walked over to the body, his boots squelching in the mud. He shone his flashlight on Skeeter's face, frozen in a rictus of terror, eyes wide and red from the gas. "Gravity," Arthur muttered, adjusting his hat. "It always wins. You build a mountain of trash, eventually it falls on you." The compound was clear of combatants, but the list wasn't finished. There were others. The extended Brody clan lived in a cluster of shacks further up the creek, on land they had squatted on for a decade. These were the men who had helped Buck strip the copper wire, the men who had laughed at the diner, the men who had turned a blind eye when Arthur's fences were cut. Complicity in Arthur's court carried the same sentence as the crime. The Vance men regrouped at the D9. The smell of the explosion was now mixed with the metallic scent of fresh blood and the chemical sting of the ammonia gas. They reloaded their weapons. The rhythmic click-clack of magazines being seated was the only conversation. "Dad," Caleb whispered, looking at the burning remains of the loader where Buck's body swayed in the wind. "What about the women? Sarah and the kids are in the blue cabin." Arthur looked at his son. His face was a mask of granite, shadowed by the brim of his hat. "We are not butchers, Caleb. We are landscapers. You don't cut down the saplings just because the oak is rotten. Unless they pick up a weapon, they are invisible. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Then let's finish the grading." They moved up the creek. The next hour was a blur of brutal efficiency. At the secondary cabin, Bo Brody tried to flee in his truck. He made it 10 yards before the tires were shot out by Joshua. When he refused to get out, barricading himself inside the cab and screaming threats about what he would do to the Vance women, Arthur simply nodded to Silas. A single armor-piercing round through the engine block cracked the block, and a second round through the driver's side door ended the standoff. The horn began to blare, a constant, mournful note echoing through the hollow as Bo's body slumped against the steering wheel. At the workshop, they found the stolen hydraulic pump. It was sitting on a workbench, half disassembled, the serial numbers filed off, surrounded by empty beer cans and cigarette butts. Seeing it there, treated with such casual disregard, stripped of its function and value, sparked something in Arthur that went beyond anger. It was a validation. He ran his hand over the cold steel of the pump housing. It was like touching the corpse of a friend. "Take it," Arthur said. "Dad, it's heavy," Joshua said, looking at the 80-pound piece of machinery. "We have to move. The police will be coming." "I said take it." Arthur's voice cracked, the first sign of emotion all night. "It belongs to the machine. It goes home. We don't leave our own behind." Joshua and Luke hoisted the pump between them, carrying it like a holy relic back down the muddy track. The absurdity of the image, men walking through a slaughterhouse carrying a piece of industrial equipment, encapsulated the entire madness of the night. They were killing for metal. They were dying for parts. By 3 a.m., the hollow was silent again. 11 men lay dead across 3 miles of terrain. The Brody line, the male lineage of the clan, had been extinguished. The women and children, huddled in the back rooms of the cabins, terrified and weeping, had been left physically unharmed, though the psychological scars would fester for generations. Arthur had walked past Sarah Brody's window on his way out. He had seen her clutching her 2 children, a shotgun trembling in her hands, pointed at the door. He had stopped, looked her in the eye through the glass, and tipped his hat. Then he had walked away. It was a mercy more terrifying than violence. It said, "I could, but I choose not to. Your life is a gift I am granting you." The retreat was as orderly as the advance. They didn't run. They didn't flee into the night like criminals. They walked back up the ridge, back to the Vance property. They cleaned the weapons in the basement. They burned the clothes stained with mud and gunpowder in the incinerator drum behind the barn. They scrubbed their hands with turpentine to remove the residue. And then, Arthur Vance did the unthinkable. He made coffee. He sat on his porch as the sun began to bleed gray light over the eastern ridges. He watched the fog slowly lift, revealing the smoke still rising from the valley below. He felt a profound sense of peace. The anxiety that had gnawed at his stomach for months, the fear of poverty, the shame of disrespect, the helplessness, was gone. In its place was the quiet satisfaction of a job completed. The road was clear. The obstruction was removed. When Trooper Pendergrass pulled up at 6:42 a.m., the scene that greeted him was a tableau of domestic normalcy superimposed over a backdrop of horror. Arthur was sipping his coffee. Martha was inside, frying bacon. The smell of pork fat and coffee drifted out, mixing with the distant stench of death and burning diesel. Pendergrass got out of his car, his hand hovering over his holster. He had seen the carnage below. He had seen Buck. He had vomited twice on the side of the road before gathering the courage to drive up the hill. He looked at Arthur, sitting there in his suit, calm as a Sunday morning. "Art," Pendergrass said, his voice shaking, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "What did you do?" Arthur set the mug down. He didn't stand up. "I fixed the drainage problem, Jim. You know how water gets backed up when there's too much trash in the culvert? Eventually it bursts. I just cleared the pipe." "There's bodies everywhere, Art. My God, he's hanging from the bucket. It looks like a war zone." "A warning sign," Arthur said calmly. "OSHA requires warning signs in hazardous work zones. People need to know where the danger lies. I have to take you in, all of you, the boys too." Arthur nodded. "I know. The boys are in the living room. They're waiting. We aren't going to give you any trouble. The work is done." He stood up then, slowly, his knees popping. He picked up the map from the table. The map he had used to plan the assault, now marked with red X's where the bodies lay. He walked down the steps and handed it to the trooper. "This will save you some time," Arthur said. "You won't have to look for them in the brush. I marked everyone except Skeeter. He fell. That was an accident." The arrest of the Vance family was the quietest operation in the history of the Kentucky State Police. There were no sirens, no SWAT teams kicking down doors, no helicopters circling overhead. Just a convoy of cruisers driving slowly up the mountain, collecting 10 men who surrendered with the dignity of soldiers going into captivity. They were handcuffed and placed in the back of the cars. As they were driven away, Arthur looked back one last time at the yellow Caterpillar D9, parked proudly in the barn, the stolen pump resting on the ground beside its tracks. It was whole again. That was all that mattered. The interrogation room at the Pike County Sheriff's Office was a cinder block box painted a color that was supposed to be calming, but looked like dried mustard. Agent Miller from the Kentucky Bureau of Investigation sat across from Arthur. Miller was a city cop from Louisville, a man who understood drug deals and gang shootings, but who looked at Arthur Vance as if he were studying a new species of predator. 11 counts of first-degree murder, Miller said, sliding the photos across the metal table. Domestic terrorism, conspiracy, kidnapping. You're looking at the electric chair, Mr. Vance. You understand that. We're going to fry you. Arthur didn't look at the photos. He looked at Miller's hands, soft hands, hands that had never held a jackhammer, hands that pushed pencils and typed reports. "I understand electricity," Arthur said. "I worked with detonators my whole life. A circuit is a circuit." "Why?" Miller slammed his hand on the table. "For a pump? For a piece of metal? You wiped out a family for $8,000? "It wasn't the money," Arthur said, leaning forward, the fluorescent light reflecting off his eyes, which were clear and terribly sane. "You think this is about money because that's all you people understand. You think a man's worth is what's in his bank account. But out here, when the money is gone, when the job is gone, when the government forgets you exist, what do you have left?" Miller stayed silent, waiting. "You have your name," Arthur whispered, "and you have the line you draw in the dirt." Buck Brody crossed the line. He erased the line. If I let him take that pump, if I let him laugh at me in that diner, then I don't exist anymore. I'm just a ghost haunting my own land. I didn't kill them for money, Agent. I killed them to prove I was still alive. The news broke nationally by Tuesday. The New York Times called it the Massacre at Dead Man's Hollow. Time magazine ran a cover story titled The Rage of the Rust Belt. The country was horrified, viewing Pike County as a savage backwater, but in the county itself, the reaction was more complicated. A fissure opened up in the community, a crack as deep and jagged as the coal seams beneath their feet. At the hardware store, at the gas station, at the church where Arthur used to pass the collection plate, people spoke in hushed tones. Nobody defended the murder of 11 people aloud. That would be monstrous. But in the quiet privacy of their living rooms, many nodded. They understood. They knew what it felt like to be pushed. They knew the humiliation of watching meth heads and thieves strip their barns while the police claimed they were overwhelmed. Arthur Vance did what we all dream of doing. A retired miner named Hobie whispered to a reporter from Lexington, refusing to give his last name. He cleaned house. It's tragic, sure, but you can't say it wasn't effective. Nobody's going to touch a Vance property for 100 years. The funeral for the Brody family was held in a high school gymnasium because no church was big enough to hold the coffins. 11 caskets lined up on the basketball court. It was a visual representation of a genocide. The surviving women sat in the front row, a black wall of grief. Sarah Brody, holding her youngest child, looked into the cameras with eyes that were dead. She didn't cry. She just stared. She was the one who had to live with the mercy Arthur Vance had granted her. She was the one who had to explain to her sons why their father was dead, and why the man who killed him was considered a folk hero by half the county. As the legal machinery began to grind into motion, it became clear that this wouldn't be a normal trial. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious attorney named David Sterling, wanted a swift conviction. He wanted to paint Arthur as a monster, a cold-blooded psychopath. But as he interviewed the witnesses, as he dug into the history of the land dispute, he realized he wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting a culture. He was fighting the code of the hills. Sterling stood in the courtroom during the arraignment, watching the Vance men file in. They didn't look like criminals. They looked like a choir, clean-shaven, heads held high, wearing suits their wives had brought to the jail. When the judge asked Arthur for his plea, the entire courtroom held its breath. Arthur stood up. He adjusted his tie. He looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, then at the weeping Brody widows in the gallery. "Not guilty," Arthur said. The gasp from the gallery was audible. "On what grounds?" the judge asked, peering over his glasses. "Mr. Vance, we have your confession. We have the weapon. We have the map." "Not guilty by reason of necessity," Arthur said. "Self-defense doesn't just mean protecting your body, Your Honor. It means protecting your life. They were killing us. Just slowly. I just sped up the clock." It was a legal absurdity, a defense that had no standing in any modern court. But Arthur Vance wasn't playing to the jury in the box. He was playing to the jury of history. He knew he was going to die in prison. He accepted that the moment he lit the fuse. The trial wasn't about saving his skin. It was about defining his legacy. It was about making sure that when people told the story of the Pike County massacre 50 years later, they wouldn't talk about a crazy old man who snapped. They would talk about a man who stood his ground when the world tried to push him off it. And as the gavel banged, echoing like a gunshot in the wood-paneled room, the real war began. Not the war of bullets, but the war of narratives. The media descended. The psychologists arrived. Everyone wanted to know why. But the answer was sitting right there in the defendant's chair, hands folded calmly on the table, eyes fixed on a point in the distance that only he could see. The answer was simple. When the system fails, the individual becomes the state, and the state has the monopoly on violence. Arthur Vance had simply declared sovereignty over his own hollow. The trial of Arthur Vance and his sons began in the suffocating humidity of July 1988, 8 months after the massacre at Dead Man's Hollow. The venue had been moved 3 counties over to Lexington in a desperate attempt by the state to find a jury pool that hadn't already canonized or condemned the master blaster of Pike County. But distance couldn't scrub the coal dust from the proceedings. The Fayette County Courthouse, a structure of limestone and judgment, was besieged. The media circus that descended was unlike anything Kentucky had seen since the coal wars of the 1930s. Satellite trucks from CNN and an NBC idled in the streets, their diesel exhaust mixing with the thick summer air, while locals sold homemade T-shirts on the courthouse steps. Some read, "Justice for the Brodies," but far more read, "Don't tread on Arthur." Inside, the courtroom smelled of lemon floor wax, stale tobacco smoke from the hallway, and the nervous, acidic sweat of 100 spectators packed onto benches designed for 50. It was a spectacle that drew national attention, not just because of the staggering body count, but because Arthur Vance refused to play the role of the remorseful sinner. He sat at the defense table not like a man fighting for his life, but like a foreman overseeing a complex, albeit unpleasant, project. He wore the same charcoal suit he had been arrested in, now pressed and starched. He took notes in a small yellow field ledger, the kind used by surveyors, occasionally whispering corrections to his court-appointed attorney. A ragged man named Eleanor struggling to keep his head above the water of a capital murder case. Prosecutor David Sterling knew that to win, he had to do more than prove Arthur pulled the trigger. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Arthur had essentially handed the police a signed receipt for the murders. No, Sterling knew he had to strip away the myth. He had to dismantle the folklore hero narrative that was metastasizing in the mountains, the dangerous idea that Arthur was a righteous patriarch protecting his clan from the failures of the state. Sterling had to show the jury the face of a monster. He began by calling the medical examiner, who detailed the overkill on Buck Brody's body, describing the trajectory of the bullets and the post-mortem blast damage. But statistics are cold. Arthur watched the slideshow of autopsy photos with the detached interest of a man inspecting a damaged bridge support. It was the human element Sterling needed. On the third day, the prosecution called Sarah Brody to the stand. She was the ghost at the feast, the woman Arthur had spared, the witness to the mercy that was more terrifying than the violence. She walked to the witness box wearing black, looking smaller than her 30 years, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to meet the gaze of the man who had extinguished her husband's entire bloodline. The courtroom went so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning units struggling against the heat. Sarah's testimony wasn't loud. It was a whisper that forced the jury to lean in, invading their personal space with her trauma. She described the sounds of that night, the initial explosion that shook the fillings in her teeth, the specific mechanical rhythm of the rifle fire that followed, and the way her husband, Buck, had screamed when the hydraulics of the loader were severed. She described hiding in the closet with her 5-year-old son, holding her hand over his mouth so tight she left bruises on his cheeks, terrified that a single cough would be a death sentence. "And then?" Sterling asked softly, standing near the jury box to draw her gaze outward. "Then the shooting stopped," Sarah whispered. "And I heard boots on the porch. Heavy boots. Slow, not running." She took a ragged breath. He stopped right outside the window. The curtains were open a crack. "I saw the silhouette of his hat. I saw the barrel of the rifle." "Did he see you, Mrs. Brody?" "He looked right at me," she said, finally raising her eyes to point a trembling finger at Arthur Vance. "He looked right at me, and he nodded. Just once, like he was doing me a favor, like killing the father of my children was a gift he was giving me. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied." In that moment, the righteousness of Arthur Vance curdled in the minds of the jury. They didn't see a protector. They saw a God complex. They saw a man who believed he had the divine power to decide who drew breath and who returned to the dirt. But the turning point, the moment that cemented the verdict and the legend simultaneously, came when Arthur Vance took the stand in his own defense. His lawyer had advised against it, begged him not to. "Arthur," he had pleaded, "if you go up there, you have to show remorse. If you don't, they will kill you." But Arthur insisted. He wanted the record to be clear. He wanted the why to be understood, not interpreted by city psychologists or lawyers who had never calloused their hands on a drill. Arthur sat in the witness box, his posture rigid, his voice calm and baritone. He didn't deny a single shot. He didn't deny the pipe bombs, the chain, or the tear gas. He treated the cross-examination like a debriefing after a controlled demolition. "Mr. Vance," Sterling asked, pacing in front of the jury box, sensing the kill. "You admit that you planned this operation for 3 days? You admit you bought the materials, scouted the location, and assigned kill zones to your own children? You turned your sons into a hit squad?" "I admit I prepared," Arthur said, his voice steady. "Poor preparation leads to poor performance. That's standard industry practice. My sons are men. They followed orders because they understood the necessity." "Industry practice?" Sterling's voice rose, incredulous, echoing off the high ceilings. "We are talking about human lives, Mr. Vance. Not rocks, not trees. Human beings, fathers, sons, neighbors." "We are talking about obstacles," Arthur corrected him, his tone devoid of malice but terrifyingly practical. "When you build a road, Mr. Sterling, you encounter rock that is too hard to drill. You encounter stumps that won't pull. You don't hate the rock. You don't hate the stump. You just apply the necessary force to remove it. Buck Brody and his kin, they were the rock. They blocked the path of my family's survival. The law wouldn't move them, the sheriff wouldn't move them, so I applied the necessary force. And the 11 men you killed? They were just debris?" Arthur paused. He looked at his hands, those massive, scarred hands that had built bridges and ended lives. He turned them over, examining the palms. They were men who made a choice. They chose to steal. They chose to humiliate. In my world, choices have weight. If you stand under a falling rock, you get crushed. They stood under the rock. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. It was a formality. Guilty on all counts. 11 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, kidnapping, use of explosives. When the verdict was read, Arthur didn't blink. He didn't look at his weeping wife, Martha, in the gallery. He looked at the judge, his expression unreadable. The sentencing phase was brief. The death penalty was on the table. The prosecution demanded it, citing the heinous and calculated nature of the crime. But the jury, perhaps moved by the sheer tragedy of the broken men before them, or perhaps uncomfortable with executing a decorated Korean War veteran, opted for life without the possibility of parole. For Arthur, for Silas, for Caleb, for Joshua, for Luke. The entire male line of the Vance family was swept off the board just as they had swept the Brodys. Judge Harrison, a man known for his harsh sentences, looked down at Arthur Vance over his spectacles before delivering the final judgment. "Mr. Vance, in my 30 years on the bench, I have seen crimes of passion, and I have seen crimes of greed, but I have never seen a crime of such cold, calculated arrogance. You appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner. You speak of dignity, sir, but there is no dignity in slaughter. You are not a builder. You are a destroyer." Arthur stood up to speak his final words. He adjusted his suit jacket, buttoning it as if he were about to walk out the front door. "Your Honor, you judge me by the laws of a book I didn't write. I judge myself by the laws of the dirt I worked. Now my family is alive. My wife is safe. The road is clear. You can lock my body in a cage, but you can't undo the work. The work is done." They sent him to the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville, a Gothic stone fortress known as the Castle on the Cumberland. It was a fitting end, a man of stone sent to live in a house of stone. Prison life for Arthur Vance was a continuation of his existence on the outside, structured, disciplined, and solitary. He didn't join gangs, he didn't fight, he didn't get tattoos, he became the librarian. For 15 years, the man who had blown up a bridge to kill his neighbors spent his days organizing books according to the Dewey Decimal System, repairing torn bindings with the same meticulous care he had once used to wire blasting caps. He was a model prisoner, but a terrifying one. Younger inmates, violent men who had killed for sneakers or turf, gave him a wide berth. There was something about the master blaster, The man who had eliminated 11 people in 3 hours without raising his pulse, that commanded a primal respect. He was the old guard, a relic of a time when violence meant something more than just impulse. He was a statue that breathed. But while Arthur thrived in the regimented world of incarceration, his sons withered. This was the true tragedy, the hidden cost of Arthur's victory. Silas, the son who had fired the first shot, the son who had always sought his father's approval, couldn't handle the weight of what they had done. He didn't have Arthur's armor of absolute conviction. He saw the faces of the Brody cousins in his sleep. He heard Ray Brody's shotgun clattering on the porch every time a metal tray dropped in the mess hall. In 1995, 7 years into his life sentence, Silas Vance hanged himself in his cell using a bedsheet braided into a rope. He left no note. Just a Bible opened to the story of Cain and Abel, the page stained with tears. When the warden told Arthur the news, Arthur didn't cry. He was polishing a pair of boots in the prison laundry. He stopped, held the brush in midair for a long 10 seconds, looking at nothing. Then he went back to polishing. "He was always soft," Arthur said quietly, his voice cracking just once on the last word. The rock broke the drill. It was the only time the guards ever saw him falter, though some claimed that from that day on, Arthur walked a little slower, his shoulders a little more stooped, the weight of the invisible D9 finally crushing him. Caleb and Joshua retreated into silence, serving their time like ghosts. Luke, the youngest, found religion, preaching to empty chairs in the chapel, begging for a forgiveness his father never sought. Arthur Vance died on November 14, 2002, exactly 15 years to the day after the massacre. He died of natural causes. His heart, enlarged from years of stress and coal dust, simply stopped beating in his sleep. He was 73 years old. He died in a 6x8 cell, surrounded by books, wearing a uniform that wasn't his, in a building he didn't build. They buried him in the prison cemetery under a marker that bore only his inmate number and the dates of his birth and death. No family came to claim the body. Martha had passed away 3 years earlier, her mind erased by dementia, forgetting both the husband she loved and the monster he became. The surviving sons were all behind bars, unable to attend. The funeral was attended only by the prison chaplain and 2 gravediggers who wanted to finish before the rain started. But the story didn't end with Arthur's heart stopping. Violence of that magnitude has a half-life. It lingers in the soil like radiation. Back in Pike County, the land where the massacre happened, Dead Man's Hollow, lay abandoned for decades. The Brody trailers were eventually bulldozed by the county, the scrap metal hauled away, ironically, by a company from out of state, but the land itself remained toxic in the minds of the locals. No one would buy it. No one would build on it. Hunters avoided it, claiming their dogs would whimper and refuse to track scents through the underbrush near the creek. The locals said the ground was sour, tainted by too much blood spilled in too short a time. The trees grew back gnarled and thick, reclaiming the road Arthur had tried so hard to clear. And what of the machine? The Caterpillar D9, the yellow idol that had demanded a sacrifice of 11 souls. It sat in a police impound lot for 5 years, a rusting piece of evidence in the state's most notorious murder case. When the appeals were finally exhausted, the state auctioned it off. It was bought by a construction firm in West Virginia for a fraction of its value. They didn't know the history, or maybe they didn't care. Business is business. They repainted it, replaced the tracks, fixed the hydraulic pump with a generic part, and put it back to work. There is a dark poetry in that. The machine that caused a massacre, the machine that Arthur Vance valued more than human life, is likely still out there somewhere today. It's pushing dirt, clearing roads, leveling mountains, completely indifferent to the blood that once greased its gears. It outlived its master. It outlived its enemies. It is the only winner in this story. The surviving Brody women and children scattered like leaves in a storm. Sarah Brody moved to Ohio, changing her name, trying to scrub the Appalachian tragedy from her skin. But you can't outrun that kind of trauma. Her son, the boy who hid in the closet, grew up with the shadow of that night draped over him like a lead blanket. He struggled with addiction, with rage, with the phantom memory of a father he only knew as a victim. The violence didn't stop with the bullets, it just changed form, morphing into needles and bottles and broken homes, a slow-motion massacre that continued long after the gunsmoke cleared. So, what is the legacy of Arthur Vance? Is he the monster the prosecutor painted? The cold-blooded narcissist who slaughtered a family over a piece of equipment? Yes. Is he the tragic figure some locals still secretly admire? The man who stood up to a broken system, who defended his livelihood when no one else would? Also, yes. And that is the terrifying part. That is why this story haunts us, because if we strip away the blood, if we strip away the horror, we are left with a question that sits uncomfortably in the center of the American experience. When you play by the rules and the rules fail you, when the social contract is torn up and thrown in your face, when your dignity is the only thing you have left and someone tries to take it, what do? Most of us would walk away. Most of us would swallow the bitterness, accept the loss, and move on. We would let them steal the pump. We would let them laugh. We would survive. But Arthur Vance wasn't built to bend. He was built to break. And when he broke, he took the world with him. Standing today at the edge of Dead Man's Hollow, looking down into the overgrowth where the salvage yard used to be, you can't hear the gunshots anymore. You can't hear the screams. The bridge has been rebuilt, stronger this time, concrete instead of wood. The trees have grown back, covering the scars on the ridge. Nature is efficient. It covers the mistakes of men with green vines and silence. But if you listen closely, when the wind comes down off the mountain just right, moving through the hollows where the sun rarely touches the bottom, you can almost hear it, the low grinding rumble of a diesel engine, the sound of metal on earth, the sound of a man trying to clear a road that leads to nowhere. Arthur Vance believed he was fixing something. He believed he was restoring order. But in the end, all he did was dig a grave big enough for 2 families. And the only thing he proved, the only lesson he left behind in the red clay of Kentucky, is that when you decide to become the law, you eventually have to become the executioner. And the executioner always dies alone. If this story of the Pike County Massacre chilled you, if it made you question the line between justice and vengeance, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We dig deep into the archives to bring you the true crimes that history tries to forget. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was Arthur Vance a villain or a victim of his own code? Until next time, keep your doors locked and remember, sometimes the most dangerous things in the dark aren't strangers. They're neighbors.